a lot of requests for internships, much more than we can accommodate. And I have been around for quite some time at the Lawyers Collective, and I have received many, many applications. And I think this was the first that expressed interest in the area of drugs and the NDPS Act. And I was pleasantly surprised, and I immediately accepted, and I have no regrets. I'm very glad that I accepted Samyak's internship. In fact, he assisted us during a very crucial case. This is a man who was perhaps, I think he's the first person to be sentenced to death under the NDPS Act in India. A Kashmiri Muslim man sentenced to death for hash. Of course, he had ostensibly a large amount on him, and he had 2 offences, and both his appeals were listed for final hearing in the Supreme Court. And it was a pretty difficult time, and fortunately Samyak was around and was very invaluable research and assistance. We were able to, for this man, he had been sentenced to death, and subsequently to 30 years after the High Court commuted his sentence. And with Samyak's assistance and Anand's arguments, we managed to get him down to 16 years. So he has another year to go and he'll be out of jail. So there was so much relief for the client and his family. I also want to just express my hope and optimism. I was at a conference, rather meeting for lawyers, drug litigation lawyers in New York a few weeks ago. And this person, Ethan Needleman, he's the head of the Drug Policy Alliance in the US. Very interesting group doing campaigning around drug policy reform. And he said every movement, whether it's been civil rights, whether it's been women's rights, whether it's been LGBT rights, every movement has had its defining court case and judgment, which has added so much momentum to that movement itself. And he said, I want to see that happen even in the area of drug law reform. But then after the discussions, he said, well, maybe it's going to take another 50 years. And then someone said, well, not 50, 70 years. So if that is true, I hope it's wrong, but if indeed that is true, then we have hope in all of you. So I mean, my turn towards human rights happened when I attended a lecture when I was in college. Heard somebody speak about sex workers empowerment, and it really got me thinking, and it changed something in me. And I'm not confident whether our talk here will do that to any of you, but to the extent that it gets you to think differently, it gets you to think a little deeper about what we have, I think it will be worthwhile. So I'm just going to just take you through an overview of the NDPS Act and the changes that we've seen so far, and then just park a few, like 5 areas which I think are now reaching a near crisis proportion, flashpoints which, if not attended to immediately and corrected and reformed, could really make things very, very difficult. So the NDPS Act, as you know, it was 1985. It was passed in a lot of hush and rush in 4 days by both houses. And if you go over, if you ever have a chance to go over the parliamentary debates, you will find that there was a lot of ignorance. And most parliamentarians said, we need more time, we don't understand what this is. One member of parliament also said, heroin? I only thought it meant to fill patches. Now you're talking about some other substance which is called heroin. So that was the level of ignorance. There was also a lot of confusion palpable in the House. As you can see, where some members of parliament said these people who use these so-called nashedis, they must be imprisoned and they must be given the harshest punishment because we need to deter others from doing the same. But there were some voices also that said, well, the person who's addicted is really a victim. And I've never seen a law that criminalizes and punishes a victim. So there were these, again, confusing voices. They didn't know what they were doing, but it was just like law was being thrust upon them. And in good faith, I think all members passed this law. Within a matter of 4 years, new law which completely changed India's response to drugs and the way that so many things that have just been a part and parcel of our lifestyle, ganja, etc., was sought to be criminalized with harsh punishments, 10 years. So it was a radical change at that time. And within the next 2 or 3 years, we're already seeing the first set of amendments. Normally we give time to laws, we give some breathing space, something. But this was just, the amendments were as hasty as the passing of the law, I would say. The 89 amendments actually made an already harsh law even harsher. So the mandatory death penalty, which had been outlawed by the Supreme Court a decade ago in Mithu's case, was brought in. So for a subsequent offence of drug trafficking, and drug trafficking also means pretty much everything, including mere possession. That's also trafficking, if it's a certain quantity. Restrictions on granting bail, a bar on commuting or suspending sentences, property forfeiture, establishment of special courts. So this really rigorous and toughened machinery was brought in by the 89 amendments. Also, if you try and locate what was the trigger for these changes, I think it's a multiplicity of factors. One was, of course, the terrorism going on in Punjab and just starting to be seen in Kashmir, and the whole cross-border, the whole nexus narco-terror, that is drugs which is fueling terrorism and all. According to me, there's a lot of rhetoric in all of that. I don't think we have ever unearthed what is the real truth, but that was the general sense. By then, we had also had the 1988 convention, which is the toughest, the 3 conventions that Amit spoke about. It is really the toughest. So a lot of these factors coming in together led to these changes. But something else was also churning, and before I come to the 2001 amendment, I want to just bring to the table the fact that it is perhaps our courts and our human rights institutions, which we generally believe are not so concerned in the area of drugs, which brought about, or which influenced the most momentous reforms that we saw in 2001. So what was happening was that because the punishment was a minimum of 10 years, the courts were seeing cases where people with very small amounts were being subjected to this severe. Because the law said that if you had, the law did allow for a small, the acknowledgement of a small quantity, but the onus was on the person who was found with the drugs to establish and prove that it was meant for his or her own use. Now the Supreme Court was confronted with many such cases, and I managed to highlight 2. One where this person had 0.04 grams of brown sugar. Brown sugar was the impure, it's like a cheaper version. He had foil and he had a matchbox. Now that quantity, foil matchbox, any sensible person would know that this is for your own use. But the court said, well, he couldn't explain what he was doing with that brown sugar, the matchbox and the foil. So therefore, he was not given the lesser punishment, but was sentenced to 10 years. In another case, this person had, again, brown sugar worth 25 rupees, like a little puri, 25 rupees. And he was sentenced to 10 years and a fine. We're talking about disproportionality. These were the kind of cases that came before the Supreme Court, and the court came down heavily on what sort of a law is this and why such. There were critical decisions from the court. But somehow, through these decisions, where the court said such a small quantity could not but have been meant for personal use, came this understanding that quantity itself is indicating what is used. So what we see now, that small quantity, less punishment, commercial quantity higher, the undertone to that is small means that it is personal. The assumption is that, and large means that it is for business. Now whether that logic actually stands is a big question mark. It is really a big question mark, because 2 So that is how what Anand was talking about, when people do 5, so they just wait to do 5 and then come out. So at least there was some easing of that happened. And also the National Human Rights Commission conducted a study and assessment of the NDPS Act and made recommendations to the government to have better graded punishment. Now, the NHRC has not been very active in many things, but I was again pleasantly surprised to find out that they have also played their part in these reforms. And therefore, in 2001, our law underwent a very significant change. And I think for the first time, or maybe I'm not aware of many other laws that have seen a similar fate, but the minister, the then minister, acknowledged that we had made a mistake, that the penalties provided are extraordinarily harsh as far as small-time offenders are concerned. Now, it is very rare for us, as I was saying, the direction that we seem to be going in, more punishment is not sufficient, we need more draconian measures. But for the first time, the minister said, no, we've gone down the wrong way. This is not the correct way to treat people, especially those who are users or small-time dealers. And despite the fact that the minister faced a lot of criticism for going soft on drugs and drugs trafficking, he stood his ground. And we introduced reforms as far as sentencing is concerned and the model of quantity-based sentencing. So just looking at that still gives me hope that if there are people who are genuinely convinced about the wrongs associated with the war on drugs and stand by their conviction and belief, as some members of parliament now seem to be doing, there is hope. And the last set of amendments we've seen is in 2014, which I was fortunate enough to contribute towards in some way, where although the bill was introduced in 2011, it was just minor changes here and there. The medical community, especially the palliative care doctors, cancer patients, really caught on to that opportunity and said, we want access to opioids for pain relief. And we seized that occasion, and I was able to do some drafting, etc., for the government, and that is how now we have this concept of essential narcotic drugs, where the licensing and provisions are simplified and supposed to make medical access easier. But it's not taken off very well for other reasons, which I will just allude to later. The other significant changes in 2014 have been that drug dependence and harm reduction measures now have some legitimacy in the law. Earlier, it was a big question mark whether treatment only meant de-addiction or going drug-free, or did it also mean long-term therapy and other measures which don't make you go drug-free immediately, but assist you in leading productive life despite the fact that you're on drugs. So that is accepted, and of course, death penalty is also being discretionary. We lobbied a lot in Parliament for its abolition, but that's another battle. So despite all these changes, some good, and I must say the more recent ones, 2001 and 2014, have by and large been positive. So it gives us hope. There are certain areas which I think are really now assuming crisis levels in this country. The first, as Anand has already alluded to, is the question of availability for medical use, and despite the law now incorporating the concept of essential narcotic drugs, there are serious problems, and the problems are largely because our law is not a law framed in the health context. It is a law and order, criminal justice measure. So, though the NDPS Act says that everything to do with drugs is prohibited except, and there is a statutory exemption provided in section 8C, except if it is for medical and scientific use, that's the first condition, and it is in accordance with the rules, to the manner and extent provided by the Act or the rules or orders passed under the Act, and in a case where such rules provide for a license, in accordance with the conditions of the license. So you have to satisfy these three things claim the exemption that this is medical use. Now, this is where a lot of problem is occurring, and we have been dealing with a lot of clients who are part of this whole rubric of medical and scientific use. We have had doctors who have been arrested, doctors who have had these medicines, psychotropic substances, have been arrested. Some have spent many months in jail before finally getting bail because we are a doctor or this, that. We have had chemists, pharmacists who have been arrested, and we have had people associated with pharmaceutical companies, right from director, manager, to sales representative. All of these, nobody has been spared. Now, I'll just come to some issues which are of import, especially from a lawyer's perspective, is that many people say, but doesn't the Act make a distinction between small and commercial? So therefore, small quantity, it's easy, restricted, hardly any punishment, bail, etc., not a problem. The issue is the minute you talk about medical use, it has to be a significant quantity. Unless, of course, it's a patient who only has their own dose. So the doctors, though they can, under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, they are authorized to keep medicines with them. There have been cases in Punjab where the doctors, he visits many hospitals, so is taking the drugs that he's lawfully procured, has all the slips and papers, etc., invoices, is traveling with the medicines in his car from one hospital to the other clinic, and the police intercept and arrest. They are nashili dawa. So nashili dawa, doctor goes, quantity na zyada hai. Now it's a doctor who's dealing with patients. He can't be having 1 or 2 tablets. He has to have, and in Punjab, you have so many patients. Secondly, if you're a pharmaceutical company, you're not going to be dealing in small quantity. As just the day before, we had a matter in the Supreme Court, and the judge said, Mr. Roha, how many kilos of ketamine? And I said, Lordship is a pharmaceutical company. You naturally are going to have. So the small and commercial is not going to come to you very easy. I'm going to deal with such medicines at a certain scale. So the minute you come into the commercial quantity bracket, you've had it. Then there's no bail, there's really nothing in 10 years is the minimum. So that is one problem. The other problem is that at what stage does this exemption really come in? When does it kick in? One would argue logically that the minute the police or the Narcotics Bureau or DRM, whoever it is, intercepts me, they should ask me whether I have a license. They should inquire. And if I'm able to at that level satisfy that I am a licensed entity, that I'm authorized to have this as production, distribution, stocking, whatever, that should be the end of the matter. But it never happens like that. They will never make inquiries about license. In fact, many of these say, I want to see whether you have an NDPS license. Now, for a lot of these things, you don't need a license under the NDPS Act. It's the Drugs and Cosmetics Act under which you're authorized to manufacture, stock, distribute, etc. And they think, they claim that license is of no use. So we have had many cases like that. Should it be at the stage of investigation when they are, finding out from people? And one current case that we're handling, everyone who has been so-called called for investigation and statements, all of them are pharma company people, and all of them have said we are pharmaceutical, we supply to them, we do this. None of that is taken into account. None of that is believed, and there's this thing, you must be the illicit kind of dealer. Should it come in at the stage of bail? Unfortunately, our courts are very reluctant. There are 2 orders that we found in the Supreme Court where the judge said if there's a license, I'm giving bail. Only the other day, the Supreme Court said, well, this is something which should be decided at the trial. So not even at the stage of framing charges, that at least I'm entitled to a discharge, I have a license. Not even that. Trial, which means that I am lawfully doing this activity with due permission, full authorization, and I have to be arrested, remain in because I'm not getting paid, and at the stage of trial, prove in my defense, because if I'm claiming an exception or an exemption, the onus is on me. That's the way the law works. So as a result of this, we are now seeing pharma people exit the trade of these medicines, opioids or other control medicines, anesthesia medicines, other medicines. And I think some of you here have worked with the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association, and they are saying a lot of multinational companies have already given up their licenses. They are exiting the field, and because they are exiting the field, a lot of small-time players are coming in, whose trustworthiness, credibility is anyway in doubt. So you're allowing, so people who are reputed, trusted, respected, those manufacturers, Cipla, etc., are exiting this because they don't want to deal with all this harassment. They don't want their staff to be arrested. And smaller players whose credibility nobody can kind of vouch for, they are coming. So we are kind of creating room for more of this to happen. I've heard figures that while India's contribution to the global pharmaceutical trade is very substantial, when it comes to trade in these products, controlled medicines as they're called internationally, our presence is negligible. So that just shows that while on the one hand we have a thriving pharma industry and we are the pharmacy of the world, as far as these medicines, which are essential, as Anand said, indispensable, there is a problem. And the third thing is, of course, that the law doesn't require you to be tried or punished if you're diverting. The law simply says if there's a contravention of the act or the rule or the license, an offence has been committed. So suppose I have a license, like I said, the doctor has a license to stock it in this clinic. He's taking from his car one license clinic to the other. He happens to be intercepted when he's driving his car. Technically, there's a violation of the license. So what does it mean? Straight 10 years. It doesn't matter whether the contravention is an inadvertent mistake or what it is. There's no requirement for there to be any illicit market diversion, etc. Simply a breach and you're in for 10 years. So it's a very serious problem, and while the government thinks that it has addressed it through the essential narcotic drugs route, unless you change the very basis of this law, unless you, like you made a distinction between small and commercial quantity, unless you make a clear distinction between licensed and non-licensed, there's going to be a serious problem. The second area which requires immediate attention, which is a serious problem, is the crisis in our criminal justice system. So the latest, the news suggests that Punjab is arresting 51 people a day. 51 arrests a day. Now, one arrest could be of several people. So they don't talk about how many people, they say 51 arrests a day under the NDPS Act. So prisons are clearly overflowing. 50–60% of people are for drug offences. They are also, despite the fact that the law provides a proper mechanism for arrest, Punjab is mass arrest. So they just go into the village and just round up people and arrest everyone without following any procedure. And like I said, sentencing is now based on quantity. The assumption being larger the quantity, the more serious or disturbing your role in the drug trade. But actually that is not true, because if you see, most people who are arrested, and the pattern that we are seeing is most people who are arrested are either simply just carrying, taking from here to there, or they have it in their truck or their car. So they're typically drivers and conductors who happen to be, now whether they are aware that they were carrying and all is a separate question, but the minute the vehicle is intercepted, the drivers rounded up and arrested. So a lot of drivers of that nature. Or people who are, the so-called, they say they are the ring leaders. They are people who are part of the industry. So one pharma person who we are representing is supposed to be the kingpin. And he's the director, he's a very reputed pharmaceutical company who's got US awards and FDA approvals and all that. And he's allegedly the key thing. So the quantity, the problem with that is that a study showed that the poorer and more vulnerable and lower down the ladder you are, the more likely that you will be carrying larger amounts. Because the carriers are not typically told what is the weight of what they are carrying. They don't even know what is the substance, and now earlier our court said that only the actual weight of the heroin or the contraband will count and not the stuff that you put in to cut the substance. Now the government has come up with a notification saying the total weight will matter. So if you have, say, 200 grams pure heroin, it will be less. If you have 500 grams heroin, which is only 100 grams heroin, 400 grams of something else, you will get, yours will be more severe and higher punishment. It doesn't stand to any logic, but that's how the law is. So the quantity distinction, though laudable, has not really solved the problem. Like I said, prison overcrowding also, because trials, as you know, take very long. The reason why special courts were set up under the NDPS Act was to provide speedy trial, but we are seeing trials typically take 7 to 8 years. By the time you file your first appeal in the High Court, you will nearly serve your sentence of 10 years. We have had so many cases. It's been so embarrassing to tell the client, we're so sorry, your appeal has not come. And I think in 2015, the Supreme Court decided an appeal which was lodged. I think the offence, so-called offence, was committed in November 1985, just days after the NDPS Act came into force. So 30 years for the whole case too. So if that is then there is a serious criminal justice issue that we are facing. The third thing that I want to talk about is the whole procedure that is employed under the law. Common sense and logic will tell you that the more severe the punishment, the more scrupulous the safeguards must be. The more scrupulously the procedure for conducting search, seizure, arrest, safeguards must be. But ironically, it's the other way around. So if you see all the harsh laws, whether it's anti-terror, whether it's anti-drugs, they have the least safeguards. So people who are accused of other offences, petty offences, will enjoy all the safeguards possible, but those who are accused of severe offences with very severe penalties, including death penalty, most safeguards are stripped off. And that's also the case with the NDPS Act. Courts have not been so vigilant about ensuring that the safeguards, for instance, safeguard section 42 about having prior information recorded in writing, or the safeguard about personal search being before a designated, gazetted higher level officer or magistrate, or even safeguards like reporting to a superior. All these are for a purpose, to ensure that there is some independent scrutiny into the procedure. Otherwise, the same officer who's making the arrest, doing the search, filing the complaint, there's a vested interest in doing these things. And it's very easy also to plant drugs on people and then incriminate and frame them. But despite the fact that we've had 5 judge benches decisions on how this has to be followed, there's really no one somewhere from their testimony. Researcher aside, every judge seems to be differing from the previous, and there's really no consistency in how we follow any of this. But the worst issue, according to me, in the procedure is that officers simply record statements. They'll catch you, they'll say, I found these drugs on you, come to my office, they'll make you sign on something. First they'll get you to say all your personal details. I'm so and so, I live here, so on and so forth. So then there's this sort of, you can imagine that all these details obviously the officer would know. So मैंने खुद ही लिखा होगा अपना statement. And then they make you say, I admit to doing this, I admit to doing this, I admit to doing that. And then that is the basis to nail you. And our courts have, again, there have been different decisions. Some courts have said that these so-called confessions are admissible. You don't need any corroboration. So if police catch me and I admit that I have done this, it's over. But some judges have been a little more critical and said, no, this is not on, safeguards have to be followed, and you need corroboration and things like that. But we are seeing cases where there's really nothing. One person is arrested, he names another person, he names another person, and the whole chain is formed. The police is lazy, they don't do any investigation of their own, they only get people to sign these statements and the case is over for them. And people have to languish. Courts say, if you claim your statement was not voluntary, the onus is on you. Now how can I'm in jail. What measures do I have to prove that I was tortured or coerced or forced or whatever? But the onus is on me. If I can't discharge that onus, I'm done for on the basis of my own statement. Do I retract that? There's also the presumption of culpable mental state, which means reversal of burden of proof. I have to prove my own innocence, and the Supreme Court has upheld the validity of this provision, saying it's not unconstitutional, but of course the prosecution has to establish foundational facts, which they rarely ever do. So the procedure, in our opinion, is not fair. It's really not fair, and then I'll come to the third point, which is about fourth point about not fair procedure, trial, perhaps again, issues, and then we have the death penalty. As you already know, it is for a subsequent offence, so not the first offence, the second time. Now, what is the question of second time is again, some lawyers have tried to argue that a subsequent offence ought to mean that I have been convicted once and I have been punished and I haven't reformed. I'm incorrigible and I do this same offence again. So therefore it is. But that is not the case. We have had 6 death cases under the NDPS Act so far, and in most cases it has been where I am, say, arrested in one city with some substance, and during the course of my further investigation, I say, well, I have some mal lying there. And if it happens to be another jurisdiction and maybe another agency, then they say this is a subsequent offence. So people are facing trials simultaneously, 2 trials, and then obviously whatever, you will get death. So is it really subsequent in that sense? Perhaps not, but that is how it is playing out. As Anand mentioned earlier, international law doesn't allow the death penalty for drug offences because it is restricted for the most serious crimes, which means intentional killing or taking of life. And we have been arguing in our cases pending before the Supreme Court that drugs do not kill. There is no taking of life. But we are confronted with several decisions of the Supreme Court where the court has observed that drug offences are more heinous than murder, because murder only takes one person's life, drugs kill society and the economy. Now, I don't know whether this is how scientific, rational, logical the statement is. It is clearly rhetoric, but this is what we are confronted with, and that is why our courts seem to believe that extreme penalty for death for drugs is and interestingly, if you are interested in the death penalty area, we have Bachchan Singh, of course, that upheld the validity of death sentence, but we are trying to argue that the Bachchan Singh decision is on the validity of death for murder. And the offence here of drug trafficking is of a different quality and character than murder. So Bachchan Singh doesn't cover us, and the constitutional validity is an open question. We're trying to develop that argument. And my last point here, apart from the death penalty issue, is what happens to people who are dependent on drugs. So of course, everyone expresses concern about ये बेचारे addict हो जाते हैं, ये बच्चों को हमें बचाना है, and all that. But really, our law doesn't help very much. So the intention may be to help the poor addict, but the effect of the law is quite the contrary. So consumption of drugs is an offence in our country. It's not a requirement under international law. Most countries don't have it, but India criminalizes. And we try to argue in Parliament that it should be done away with. And it's no, but ये तो debtor तो करना चाहिए बच्चों को, सीख देना चाहिए learn a lesson. Now we have an interesting case where this poor fellow, a pretty poor man from a Jubilee area, he was arrested from a public park. It was typical brown sugar foil matchstick case. He is arrested, and after some time he was released on bail. Now he was addicted, he was pretty much hooked on. And then he moved to a rehab center for his treatment. And he thought कि छोटा केस है मुझे छोड़ दिया. He didn't know that he was out on bail and he was supposed to keep appearing in court. He was happily recovering in rehab. In the meantime, because he never turned up in court, he was declared a proclaimed offender. I think 1 or 2 years later, after he had done his rehab and he was fully fine, and he started working in that drug treatment center, very proud, and I'm a counselor and I'm helping people. The police suddenly come and catch him and take him to send him to prison. So his mother approached us and she wanted help. So we said, okay, we'll see what it is. And his mother said, "Hey, मैडम ये समझ नहीं आ रहा, जब ये लड़का वो नशा करता था तब तो उसको कुछ किया नहीं, अभी वो सुधर गया है तो उसको पकड़ के जेल में बंद कर दिया, ये क्या है?" So it really, the stupidity, the absurdity of the law and how it was really clear then. Anyway, he had to plead guilty and then yeah, that really tells you how the law works. The other thing is, of course, our law does allow for immunity if you volunteer to undergo treatment, but it's not what is this treatment, how does this immunity operate is not clear. So people have come to us, and of course they're all young people like you, college going, have maybe used drugs, and then at a party police come arrest. So they come and say कि अभी एक certificate कहाँ से मिलेगा कि मैं addict हूँ. So and I've had doctors from AIMS call and say, look, I really want to help this person, but is it okay if I issue this certificate to this person? Is an addict? Doesn't look like one, doesn't and obviously there's no clinical criteria to judge your blood and urine will only show use, not show addiction. But that's how it is. People are getting certificates of addiction to get out of the immunity clause. But again, courts have been very moralistic about it. And I don't know if you're aware of this one case in the Bombay High Court, where there was again these arrests of young people at a party. And this girl was apparently not just using but also selling. So that was what the police said. And the High Court came down so strongly saying that she's a young woman and she's at a party and she's not just using, she's selling. It is not available to people who are, who have offences other than use. But that's not the law. The law says any small quantity offence, you're eligible for immunity to satisfy the condition. But that's how, we are seeing this provision apply. Also, it says it will be withdrawn if you don't complete treatment, which means that I don't know what they understand by treatment. It's a long-term process. Getting off drugs doesn't happen overnight. It requires time, it requires assistance, pharmaceutical substances, etc. The other line of, which is emerging, and if you're interested, you should look this up, is that India has this concept of registered users. So under many states, there are rules where if you are, say, an opium user and you claim it to be a medical necessity, you can be registered and you can buy your opium from the government shop. This practice is on in many states. But some years ago, the central government clamped down and said, what is this? Registered users? हम ऐसे दे रहे हैं लोगों को कोई medical necessity नहीं है. So they advise, because this is part of the state rules, so they advise the state governments to reduce the number of people who are registering and then finally stop this. Now this led to a lot of problems, especially in Rajasthan. And I'll give you two High Court cases which show a very different approach to this issue. So Rajasthan has banned all their opium and poppy straw availability. So there are licensed vendors who supply to these registered users. So they said, we are not renewing anybody's license. So they didn't say we are stopping medical use, but where are they going to get it from? All the licenses have been not renewed. They're not cancelled, but they're not renewed. So they can't technically go to the vent and get their opium. So people petitioned the High Court, and the Rajasthan High Court recognizes that this is medical and people need it. So they said, okay, instead of the wells, you go to government hospitals and make sure the poppy or opium is supplied there, but strictly on the basis of your registration and medical certificate. And the court was pretty empathetic to these users. The same thing happened in Gujarat. And now I don't know what is the nature of arguments, but the Gujarat High Court says there is no right to use narcotic drugs under Article 21. So I'm sure there was an attempt to argue that medical use is part of right to life and right to health, as I'm saying. But the court says, "Ye kya hai? No fundamental right to use opium or narcotic drugs. Get out, you should stop all this." This is creating a lot of problems. I spoke to somebody from Rajasthan who said it's the elderly people who are affected because they are the ones who've been using this for a long time. And while earlier it was a matter of, you know, social propriety and prestige to be, it's a part of the social cultural framework there. And now suddenly these elderly people are like, because it's not available legally, they have to get it from other sources, smuggling, etc. Prices have skyrocketed. So now the same elderly people have become a burden on their family. कि अब तुमको तुम्हारा ये opium poppy दोदा लाने के लिए अभी हमको इतना पैसा कट करना है तुम निकलो. So this person is telling me that it's really the elderly who are the most vulnerable and they don't know where to go and what to do. So we are clearly not resolving the problem of drug use and dependence by administering the law in this fashion. So I think all of these 4-5 factors that I've listed out are really telling us that our laws are not working, it's not helping people, it's not really helping society, and there is a dire need to change the course, change the direction in which we're moving. How it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, we don't know. But there's certainly a need to start talking moving forward.
Okay, since Saptarshi has gone, whatever, any questions? Any questions? Because you have been very patient. So.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. I want to speak to you.
Any questions or comments?
I have a few comments. So, the first comment is that when we are talking about drug policy regulation, what kind of drugs should be permitted and what should not be, I think hash or weed are pretty much basic drugs that are available in the market, and for much more severe narcotropic or psychotropic substances, the general populace doesn't have the knowledge of what amount is moderate itself. So for those people, without proper knowledge, even consumption of small amounts of drug itself is harmful. In that scenario, that's where the argument of whether consumption of drug itself is harmful or not, that's where I'd like to use it. And the second thing that I wanted to point out was, I can't remember it right now, but yeah, one would be the education qualification. Even for the general public, there should be somewhat level of education there. So yeah, I can see a surprise on
education about what?
Not education as such, normal school process of teaching about the drugs itself, but some sort of awareness. So even if you are someone who hasn't gone to schooling, but if you are using some other drug, something that's much more heavier than this, the other person or the peer group with whom you have explored that sort of drug should at least make you aware of the consequences and to what extent should that drug be administered if it's just being used for recreational purpose.
That's a good point. When I was actually presenting in the evening earlier, I thought that, like there are classes for wine drinking, which is not only the etiquette of it, but also that you should drink maybe a glass a day, and then with the dinner you can have another glass. The idea is to have it in moderation, because it's as euphoric or whenever relaxing or gives you a kick or whatever it is. And that's the way to do it. So I think if we actually were to legalize, there should be an attempt to educate, counsel, give information about these things. Otherwise it loses its purpose.
Yeah, also, since it's for recreational purpose, it should be utilized in such a manner that the recreational purpose itself is maximized and reduction of the harm. So,
so you educate people.
Yeah, you'll be deriving more benefit and you'll be cutting down the
harm. It should be available only at, say, clubs.
Maximization not in that sense, but of the, so once you consume, you should be happy enough that you consume, and you shouldn't start having phobias that. So recently I had an experience with a friend of mine. He mixed two of the substances and he started panicking. He started reading articles whether that would lead to death or not. I just simply asked him that it's fine, you should just relax. We've been doing this thing for quite a long time.
It's been recorded.
By the way, NCB has issued a warning to all colleges and universities saying if there's anything found with students in your campus and you don't tell us, we will hold you responsible and book you for under section 25, allowing premises to be used.
If you're in JNU, you wanted to the government advocates were trying to argue that they will have the CCTV cameras in the corridors and even in the room. So the judge said that really happened. So, but anyway, the point is that I think if you have this kind of legalization, it will be profitable. Okay, like for example, there is a package warning: smoking is injurious. Actually, cannabis, if you smoke it, maybe it have other effects. But if you just take it in a cake or when you drink, it has other effects. So those kind of educational leaflets and promoting them is very, very important. Otherwise, I think it's not good to just let it loose as it were. Any other points? People are tired. No? Okay then. Sorry.
Thank you for coming to our college and giving this education. You can think about something. Maybe if you're interested in this field, because not many people, this is a human rights field where people are not interested. We talk about LGBT rights and other human rights, but this is an area where people are not actually interested. So, if you guys think that you're interested, you can approach me or you can approach anyone out there and you can talk about it more in detail.
I was having an admission to make, but many years ago, I met somebody, some inexperienced lawyer, I think it was in Haryana or Punjab, and I said, I'm very down to do MBBS. I said, madam, आप तो young हो. नहीं आप नहीं करो ये, आप नहीं. सर मुझे इंटरेस्ट देखिए कोई सक्सेस तो मिलता नहीं है, ना बेल मिलता है, ना डिस्चार्ज मिलता है, ट्रायल में भी कन्विक्ट होता है, क्लाइंट समझते हैं काबिल ही नहीं है, लॉयर तो आपका तो करियर उधर ही रह जाएगा. So don't do it. And the number of difficult cases we have had, I keep coming back to that. I say maybe he was right, but I'm still determined and I'm going forward in this area. So don't take that person's word. So please do follow this if it interests you.
Thank you very much.